Welcome back, my erudite friends, to another edition of MonteCristo's Power Rankings, the Thinking Fans Power Ranking. Today we'll be going through the top 10 teams in the Overwatch League right before the start of Week 5 of Stage 1. So this will be hopefully the last power ranking that we're doing with the GOATS meta in mind. Feel free to see my 11 through 20 rankings in another video on this channel. So starting at number 10, we have moved the Hangzhou Spark down 3 places. And a lot of people will probably be curious why they were only moved down 3 places. Well, they managed to take a win against the Gladiators as the Gladiators were looking better, and losing to the Defiant and the Shock in the current power rankings doesn't actually knock you down that much. They played, a somewhat competitive game against the Shock. I think a little bit less so against the Toronto Defiant. They still seem like they're having nerves or shot calling issues on stage, but they also came out and did a pretty good job against the Gladiators. Now, granted, that was Week 3 Gladiators. Week 4 Gladiators looked a lot better. But that said, 1 and 2 with 2 losses against very top teams in this power ranking means that they're going to fall a little bit further down the rankings, but not a whole lot. At number 9, we will have the Atlanta Reign moving up 3 spots. Now, after their win over Paris, it looked like they might move up a lot further, but then Paris played some more matches. Seems like they're on the down and out. And also Atlanta in Week 4 ended up getting smashed by the Gladiators, which really didn't help their cause. Now, I think they're good, and I think they did do enough. One thing that I worry about with this Atlanta lineup is that the Gladiators seem to identify that if you control Pokpo and Dako in the front line, because of how much damage, in particular, Pokpo and sometimes Erster is doing on the Brigitte, that there isn't enough damage to actually finish off eliminations. Defran doesn't have the highest damage as Zarya, but he does have a lot of final blows, which means he's actually trying to finish off most of the damage that Pokpo and Erster are doing. Gladiators put a lot of pressure on Pokpo, I think as part of a specific game plan to deal with Atlanta, and Atlanta had basically no answers to it. So Atlanta needs to make some adjustments, but even so, their impressive win over Paris was enough to put them up just a little bit higher in the rankings from 12 to 9. At number 8, falling 1 spot is the Guangzhou Charge. I feel like Guangzhou is a team that I have a very difficult time reading because on the one hand, you have a team that looks like they have a lot of potential, a lot of skill. Hotba is an amazing, versatile carry in this meta. They played a pretty close series, I think, against the LA Gladiators, and they've shown that they can hang with elite teams. They've taken the Vancouver Titans to 5 maps previously. But then they also go to 5 maps against the Florida Mayhem, right? And they struggle perhaps a little more than they should against the Los Angeles Valiant. So this is a team that seems to play to the level of their opponent and doesn't give me a lot of faith in sort of their consistency or their ability to really go far in the playoffs. So right now, Guangzhou Charge just gonna take a little bit of a step down. Again, that it might be a little bit surprising because their big loss was to the Gladiators and they were getting wins, but they were getting wins over Florida and the Valiant. So not the most impactful overall. Moving down to number 7 from number 5, down 2 steps, is the London Spitfire. And London, before coming into Week 4, had not lost a match since Week 1. They played, I think, a pretty sloppy series against Shanghai, still took them to 5 maps. But for me, London, when they play GOATS, they don't play the ult economy very well. And it seems like when they get stressed out, when it's overtime or when they need to make a comeback in a map, they tend to go for big individual plays. They sort of default to, I will mechanically outskill this other player. They don't reset fast enough. They don't come back, discuss things, try and play around their economy. They freak out and try and make individual plays. And this is really bad because this is exactly how you lose GOATS maps, and I think we saw that on map 5 in particular against the Shanghai Dragons. Also, Shanghai revealed that if they're not running Bird Ring, sometimes Widowmaker on control, like we saw from DM, can throw them for a loop. So London, in spite of a close match against the Shanghai Dragons, and even a win over the Gladiators, I still don't have the utmost confidence in this roster. Maybe they can make the playoffs. Seems like kind of a long shot right now, but they are going to go down a couple. Another big mover, and I'm sure many Texans will be happy about this, is going to be the Dallas Fuel from 14 all the way to 6. So that's obviously plus 8 slots is a massive shift in a power ranking. But given that Dallas has now stabilized in week 3 and 4, we're not seeing effect anymore. We're seeing the emphasis placed on AKM to carry this team. They also reeled off those back-to-back wins over the Shanghai Dragons, and they looked better in the second match, obviously, than they did the first. Clean 4-0 in the second match, 2-3 in the first one, and overall Dallas Fuel seem at 4-2 like they're extremely likely to go to the playoffs, particularly because they play Boston in the final week of competition, which is a match that they should be pretty heavily favored to win. With Dallas, I do have some concerns about them playing against elite GOATS teams. I don't think they'll probably make it out of the quarterfinals, even if they make it to the playoffs. But I think this is a team that has consistently gotten better, that has figured out which players to use. RCK is playing well now. They're flexing him to the Sombra. AKM is the default Zarya. They've really locked in their roster for the rest of this stage, and their coaching seems that it's really progressing the team overall. So Dallas, I think, definitely going to be a playoff team. That should be very exciting for their fans. Means actually, ever since Arrow joined the team, they were in playoffs in Stage 4 of last year, and now they're in playoffs in Stage 1. So this is a team that is definitely on the up and up. Number 5 will be the LA Gladiators. I think this one's going to be controversial because the Gladiators, of course, lost to London and the Spark in week 3. But in week 4, they came back and they absolutely destroyed the Atlanta Reign. And then they did a very good job of beating the Guangzhou Spark. And because power rankings are mostly about, we're trying to figure out at the current time who would beat whom. And the Gladiators are eliminated from the stage playoffs, but it looked like they had fixed so many of their issues. They were playing as a unit. Decay and Roar and Void were not sort of shooting off and dying at the start of fights. They looked cohesive. They were sticking together. Big Goose said in an interview after their match against Atlanta Reign that they had some comms problems that they had cleaned up. And truly, this is looking like a top 5 team right now, if we are to judge their last week's performance. So Gladiators, I think they're starting to figure it out. Whether it'll be too late in a GOATS meta, is the question. They're going to end this stage 3 and 4 without a shot in the playoffs. And we may see, depending on the meta, Surefour more going forward. But the coaching staff has always been good. The strats have always been good for the Gladiators, and I have confidence that they're going to bounce back. The biggest mover of this entire power rankings from our previous one to this one is the Toronto Defiant. And we're putting them at number 4. And that is a massive shift of 9 places. Why are we moving the Toronto Defiant up this far? They lost to New York. They beat Boston, but then they did very well against Chengdu and Hangzhou. And Chengdu and Hangzhou may not be the most challenging opponents in this current meta, but I think Toronto is probably the most improved team week to week in the Overwatch League, and they look like a very solid GOATS team right now. They started off with some nerves at the start of the league, but they end 5-2 as an expansion team. And again, it's really that progression that we see from Toronto. And they've got some massive contributors too. Ivy and Envy have slowly crept up the ranks of Overwatch players into, the top 2, 3, 4 in most categories on Zarya and Diva, respectively. Remember, they didn't have Neko at the start of the season, who is now a huge part of this Defiant roster. So you're really starting to see them gel together. My one concern is that in the playoffs, they have been somewhat vulnerable to surprise strategies. I think their coaches do a good job of prepping them, like we saw against Chengdu for specific strategies. But when Chengdu busted out some really weird stuff on Volskaya, they didn't really have a good way of adapting, and they ended up actually losing that match. So, that map, I should say. They won the match, lost the map. So I would be curious if other teams could throw them off with surprise strategies, because their players, without their coaches there to provide a plan, don't react very well within a game. So that would be my one concern with them heading into the playoffs. Otherwise, in this meta, in GOATS, very, very solid at this point in time. No movement for our number 3, which is the San Francisco Shock. some people might look at a score line and say, hey, well, the Shock got 4-0'd by the New York Excelsior, but many of those maps were really, really close. Also, over the last 2 weeks, they've won 3 of their last 4, beating Hangzhou, beating Washington, and beating the Paris Eternal. Maybe not the most impressive wins, but when they're against lower-ranked teams, they tend to perform very well in a very dominant fashion. If you're a San Francisco fan, the thing that I would be most worried about is currently against Vancouver and the NYXL, they haven't performed well in clutch situations. And by what I mean by that is that they tend to lose a lot of team fights in overtime against good teams. And if you're going to be truly elite, if you're going to win that playoff series against New York or Vancouver, you need to be able to play them close and then win some of those maps. And they've only won 1 map between their matches against New York and Vancouver, and they easily could have won most of them, actually. Not easily, but they could have had an opportunity to win most of them, and they were very competitive maps overall. But at the end, things seemed to fall apart. So there is sort of a choke factor there in stress situations for the Shock that I think is preventing them from being at the truly God-tier level of the NYXL or the Titans right now. Coming in at number 2, descending from the first spot, is the Vancouver Titans. And it's hard because we have 2 teams that are so far undefeated in the Overwatch League in NYXL and Vancouver. Vancouver will have to play the Charge again next week, and remember, the Charge took them to 5 maps. I think the concerning thing about Vancouver is they seem less consistent, and sometimes they take risks that backfire against them. And like the Toronto Defiant, they seem to be somewhat confused by what Chengdu was doing to them. And I do wonder if you run unorthodox strats against Vancouver and you force them into playing Somensu on McCree or Sombra, they look a lot worse than playing standard Rhine Goats. So that in mind, with Vancouver playing that close match against Chengdu, losing a map to the Valiant, I do have a few questions about Vancouver's consistency, whereas I think we see much more dominant play from the NYXL, where they don't really give an inch to their opponents. So Vancouver, they may be just screwing around. They may tighten it up into the playoffs. The number 1 and number 2 are very close. And of course, that means that at number 1, moving up 1 position, is the New York Excelsior. And this comes off of, a strong week. They beat in week 3, beat Toronto, beat Seoul, right? They 4-0 the Shock. Again, very close series, but they're the ones who come out on top in all 4 of those matches. So they continue to roll. They're the first team to finish off the 7-0 season, and they just look so controlled right now in their gameplay. They're sort of the polar opposite style of the Vancouver Titans. Vancouver's very aggressive. New York is a team that it plays very passively, position-based. They wait for you to make a mistake. They wait for Jonak to make a play, to get a pick-off. So they're very patient in their style, and that patience has proven quite successful for them. So thank you very much for joining me for another Power Rankings. I hope you guys have all been enjoying them, and we will be back with more once we take a look at the patches before the start of Stage 2, Week 1. So enjoy the Overwatch League stage playoffs, and we'll be back before the second stage starts. Thanks for watching.